So let's look into the scriptures just now. We're going to talk about an issue today that a lot of churches won't talk about this, but we're going to talk about it because our preaching theme for this year is things that need to be said. And if you have the opportunity to listen to much news today, you understand that the 2020 political campaign season has already begun. They're already out there campaigning. And many of the liberal politicians are campaigning right now on a platform of socialism. And so today, I don't want this to just be a political sermon, but I want it to be a sermon that helps you understand what socialism is from a biblical point of view. I want you to understand from the Bible whether the Bible endorses or does not endorse socialism. And in order to do that, we have to know what socialism is and what the Bible has to say about it. So we're going to begin this sermon. The title of it is The Biblical View of Socialism. And we're going to begin with Mark chapter 14, the first part of verse number 7. Jesus said this, "The poor you will always have with you." You get that? The poor you will always have with you. American politicians for generations have missed that. We have a huge part of our federal budget today going all the way back to FDR's New Deal in the aftermath of the Great Depression that is devoted to eliminating poverty in America. Are you realize that? All the social programs, all the spending that's done on the welfare state and all kinds of things like that, all these entitlements that the government is offering to people designed to eliminate poverty. What does this verse say from the mouth of Jesus? Are we ever going to eliminate poverty? That's what this says, isn't it? The poor you will always have with you. Now, the reason I bring this up is that we have heard more about the issue of socialism in the news in the last 6 months than we have heard in the past decade. I mean, people didn't talk about it. The idea of promoting socialism in America was something people, even if they believed it, they didn't talk about it because it was so unpopular. But today, in a generation of millennials, it has become a very popular thing. In fact, several liberal candidates for president are declaring their intention, if elected, to transform the U.S. economy into a socialist economy. A lot of the liberals that are running, that's what they say they're going to do. Therefore, in order to understand the times and to cast informed votes when 2020 rolls around, we must accurately define socialism. Socialism is an economic philosophy that advocates fiscal equality. You know what fiscal equality means? Nobody should be rich, nobody should be poor. Is that what Jesus said? The poor you will have with you always. But that's what socialism says. Socialism says that there should be fiscal equality. The idea that nobody should be rich and nobody should be poor. Oh, that sounds good, doesn't it? To the person who does not understand the scriptures, that sounds good. Now, it especially sounds good if you consider yourself among the poor. You get that? Because then what socialism does, it's kind of like a huge government that we would name Robin Hood. Do you remember Robin Hood? What did Robin Hood do in that fable? He stole from the rich and gave to the poor because it was all about equality. Do you understand that when the government taxes you on your wealth so it can give a portion of those taxes to the poor, it's doing the same thing that Robin Hood did. And it's doing the same thing that Jesus says will never work as an end to poverty, because he said you're always going to have the poor with you. We need to understand that. So if you consider yourself poor, you say, man, that sounds really good. What if you consider yourself among the wealthier? That don't sound good at all then, does it? It's the redistribution of wealth in order to eliminate poverty. But here's the deal. Here's what I want you to see. The problem with socialism was revealed during a scene that unfolded in the life of Jesus when he was in Bethany in the home of Simon the Leper. A woman came in with an expensive jar of perfume, and she poured it on his head. And some in the crowd objected to what they perceived as a waste of this expensive perfume, which could have been converted into cash and used to help the poor. And Jesus scolded them. You get that? This woman had evidently worked. I'm not even going to get into the discussion about what her line of business was, but anyway, she had worked. She had saved money. She had enough wealth that she could buy this expensive jar of perfume. And she brought it in and she broke it open and she poured it on Jesus as an act of love and devotion and worship to him. And they they complained about that. The religious people, they complained about that. They said, why this waste? This could have been sold and the money could have been used to help the poor. What was that all about? Fiscal equality. Eliminate poverty. Look what Jesus said in Mark chapter 14, verses 6 to 8. He said, leave her alone. I love that, don't you? They're complaining about what she had done. Jesus said, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. Get this. The poor you will always have with you. There's not ever going to be fiscal equality. There are always going to be people who are poor. And you can help them anytime you want. I want you to get this now. This is an important principle that we need to apply to government fiscal policy. Here's an important principle. First of all, accept the fact that there are some people that are always going to be poor. Are you aware of that? There are some people that if you gave them $1 million a week from now, they would be going hungry. Are you aware of that? The poor you're always going to have with you. You can't create a governmental system that is going to eliminate poverty. Some people are going to be poor because of their forms of behavior. Okay? Now, Jesus said they're always going to be here. But then look what he said next. You can help them anytime you want. Amen. You get that? So should we help the poor? Yes. But it's voluntary. You get that? You can help them anytime you want. It should not be a forced issue by a government policy that says that we're going to, by taxation, take a portion of your money and we're going to use that to help the poor. Jesus says that should be a matter of conscience and it should be something that you do voluntarily. Do you get that? And so that's what's wrong with socialism. Socialism forces the productive in the society, the taxpayers in the society, forces them to help the poor across the board, whether they want to help all of those poor people or not. Oh, I'm on a soapbox. Let me give you this now. We should help the poor, right? But if that were left up to our individual consciences as Christians, we would see to it that we help the poor in ways that do not enable them to continue in a lifestyle that is detrimental to them and to the society around them. Amen. Isn't that true? Can I give you an example? This is kind of crass. This is not in your notes. You know, when it's not in your notes, we're usually in trouble. But this is it. You got to get this. We have a socialist system. At least part of our government, financial policies are socialist today. The whole welfare deal is a socialist deal. And I hope that doesn't offend somebody in here, but it is. It's a socialist deal. And so here's the thing. We have this welfare system that says this, and I don't want to offend you ladies that are in here, but it says this. It basically says that we're going to pay you not to work, and then we're going to pay you to keep having children while you don't work. Am I hitting the nail on the head here? And a huge percentage of these women who are in that system and even feel trapped in that system are women that continue to have babies most of the time out of wedlock, because if they continue to have babies, they get a bigger check. Am I telling the truth or not? So that means that you and I, through taxation in a socialist form of government, are forced to support this woman's lifestyle when her lifestyle is detrimental to her children, and to the society around her at large. That's why God says it ought to be voluntary. It ought not to be coerced helping of the poor. We can select not only who it is that's poor that we help, but how we go about helping them. Do you understand that? That's the way God set it up to be. That's the way God wants it to be, and that's what Jesus is explaining here. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. You see, this woman may not have known it, but prophetically, she was giving out the message that Jesus is going to die, and that part of their burial process involved pouring perfume on the body mixed with myrrh and aloes and wrapped in linen strips, and she was doing that ahead of time. It was prophetic that Jesus was going to die, but in the middle of that, he took time out to explain the fiscal policy of helping the poor voluntarily and not by a socialist form of government forcing you to do it the way the government thinks it ought to be done. Do you understand that? That's pretty simple, I think, if you look at it. And so that's what Jesus wants us to understand. And then I want to give you this. He said, the poor you will have always, you always have with you. So there will never be a time in human history, regardless of the dreams of our liberal socialist politicians, when there will be fiscal equality. That is not going to happen. It will not happen. Now, I want to just talk to you. That's kind of the basic definition and the biblical problem with socialism. But I want us to talk about some other problems with socialism. Some other problems. Let's talk about the whole purpose of civil government from a biblical perspective. What's the purpose of civil government? The socialist goal of fiscal equality is achieved by empowering the government to control the production and the distribution of goods and services. Are you aware of that? When socialism really overtakes the government, then what happens is the government gets so big and so powerful it gets in control of the production and the distribution of goods. You know why the government has to do that? To make sure everybody only gets their fair share. Because remember, it's fiscal equality. Just study history. Every nation that has been a socialist nation all through history, ultimately, private property, private ownership of property went out the window. The government owned everything. The government had all of the employees. Everybody worked for the government. And then the government decided how much of the pie each of you get. That's what happens. The only way to assure fiscal equality is if the government owns it all, you work for the government, and the government decides how much of the pie you get. How many of you want to live under that? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not realistic. It has never worked in human history. It takes away the freedoms of people. One of the fundamental rights, private ownership of property, that goes out the window. However, when Paul described God's purposes for civil government, this is what he wrote. Everyone, this is in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 down through verse number 4, some excerpts from these verses. Everyone must submit to the governing authorities. So government is a good thing, and we need to submit to the government. All authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. Do what is right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants sent for your good, but if you are doing wrong, they have the power to punish you. That's Paul's definition of the purpose of civil government. The purpose of civil government is to honor in various ways those who do right, those who are law-abiding, morally upright citizens, and to punish those who do wrong. The purpose of civil government is to police the nation internally and to protect the nation externally. The federal government's primary responsibility is to maintain a system of internally policing the nation. We should have police department and FBI and a Secret Service and all of that kind of thing to make sure that internally our laws are enforced. And then the government should keep a standing army, a strong military for the purpose of protecting our nation from outside influences that would try to do wrong to us. That's the primary purpose of government. And then I hear liberal politicians complaining about how much money we spend on homeland security and how much money we spend on immigration and how much money we spend on the military, and take that money away from them and put it into social programs. My friend, that's exactly opposite of what the Bible would see as the purpose of civil government. It's for the purpose of honoring those who do right and for the purpose of punishing those who do wrong. Now, If that's the case, if the purpose of civil government is to police and protect the nation by maintaining this internal police force and a military force that will honor those who do right and punish those who do wrong, if that's what the purpose is, then the purpose of civil government is not socialism. It is not the production and distribution of goods and services. Do you understand that? That's not what the government is all about. So that's one thing. Another problem with socialism, and I've already mentioned this, but it's the private ownership of property. Do you realize that that's one of the things that sets America apart from most places in the world today? Is that we have some very strict laws that protect our ability to privately own and utilize property. Under a socialist economic system, since the government is responsible for the production and the distribution of goods and services, then there's no need for the private ownership of property. The government owns everything. However, when God set up civil government for his chosen nation, the nation of Israel, he included the concept of private ownership of property. In fact, 2 of the 10 commandments clearly indicate God's intention that individuals privately own property. Neither of these commandments make any sense unless there are some things that are legally the property of another individual. Here it is. The 8th commandment says this: you shall not steal. That's in Exodus 20:15. What is the whole concept of stealing? You take something that is owned by somebody else. That implies the private ownership of property. Do you get that? Private ownership means that it's possible that some evil person might take what you own, and that's stealing. And God said, I want private ownership of property, and I don't want you to take something somebody else owns. So he put that commandment in there, you shall not steal. That makes no sense if there's no private ownership of property. So it's important that you get that and that you understand that when you look at that, then socialism begins to crumble. And then the 10th commandment says this in Exodus chapter 20, verse number 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. And then it lists several other things. Or anything that belongs to your neighbor. What does that imply? Private ownership. Your neighbor owns some things, and you are not supposed to covet what belongs to your neighbor. Do you understand that? You know what covet means? Covet means that you desire it. Covet means that you walk by your neighbor's house and you see what he's got there, and you allow your heart to get into the condition where you are desiring, you are lusting after, you are coveting, you want what your neighbor has. And do you know why God told us not to covet what our neighbor owns? Private ownership. Why should you not covet? Because when you covet, you are only one small step away from violating the other commandment, which is stealing. You get that? Nobody ever stole anything that they first didn't covet. You don't steal something you don't want. You steal something because you want it. Now, your motive for wanting it may be varied, maybe all kinds of different motives for wanting it, but you'll never steal something you don't want. And so he said, don't desire what belongs to your neighbor, implying the private ownership of property. And he said, don't even desire that, and then you're safeguarded and you won't steal it. You get that? I could just go on and on about that, but I won't. Let's move on. Let's talk about another problem with socialism. It's the virtue of diligence. You know, the Bible talks about diligence. Diligence means just working hard at whatever you're doing. Diligence, it just means doing a good job. It means doing your job completely and thoroughly with energy and with drive and with determination. That's diligence. History clearly reveals that when a socialist economic system is implemented in a nation, competition is eliminated. No competition. Why do some companies do better than others? Because the competition. And they realize that we got to hire diligent workers, and we got to have leadership in this company that's diligent, and they got to work hard and with some passion to make this company successful. Do you understand that? Now let's get to this. This is not in here either, but I'm just going to throw this in, no extra charge. Here's the deal. When you are a Christian and you go to work for some company, and you are lazy on the job, and you're working harder to get out of work than if you would just do the work, then you need to be fired. And if the people who are in leadership in that company were smart, they would fire you. Do you understand that? Because here should be the view of the Christian in the workplace. The view should be, in order for me to keep a job and make a living for my family, I've got to do everything I can do to see to it that this company is successful. If the company's not successful and keep making money, then I'm going to be out of a job. Do you understand that? So you ought to go to work every morning thinking, I'm going to do the best I can do today to make this company make some money, because unless the company makes money, there's not going to be any money to pay me. Does that make sense to you? I can't tell you at the number of young people that I talk to that don't like to work. That's another whole sermon. And they don't like to work, and so when they do go to work, they do as little as they can possibly get by with, and then the company profits go down when there's enough of them in there doing that, and then they can't give them raises, and they don't give them benefits, and they have to take away benefits, and ultimately the company may go bankrupt, and they're out of, and then they're whining. And I'll say, you did this to yourself. Diligence is an important virtue to make any free market society, as opposed to a socialist society, work. It's just imperative that happen. And so diligence, it's just imperative that we have diligence. But history will show us that these socialist economic systems, when they're implemented in a nation, competition's eliminated, and therefore diligence is stifled. You see, if there's no reward for diligent work, then people will simply not be diligent. I mean, if you go in and work really hard to try to make this successful, and the fellow next to you isn't working hard at all, and yet at the end of the day you're all going to get paid the same. That's what socialism says, fiscal equality. You're all going to get paid the same. No promotions, none of that for diligent work. You just go in and you do your work, and at the end of the day everybody gets paid the same. If you're just busting your hump and you're sweating like a dog and the other fellow's sitting there doing hardly anything, and at the end of the day you both get paid the same, what are you going to do tomorrow? You're not going to bust your hump tomorrow, are you? No. And that's what socialism does. It stifles diligence. When laziness and diligence are compensated equally, then people will be lazy every time, and productivity will rapidly decrease. That's the problem with socialism. So, when productivity decreases, so does wealth. And that's why King Solomon wrote this in Proverbs 4:10. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Does that sound like fiscal equality to you? You got poverty and you've got wealth in the same sentence. And remember, the guy who wrote this, King Solomon, was the wisest man that ever lived other than Jesus. And he said, God's system is that when you're diligent, you should be compensated for your diligence. And when you are lazy, you should be penalized for your laziness. Do you get that? Lazy hands make for poverty, and diligent hands bring wealth. The implementation of an economic system that encourages laziness is certainly not wise, according to Solomon. King Solomon instructed his sons to learn the value of diligence and therefore become wise. This is what he wrote. And do you realize that most of the Proverbs written by Solomon were written as a little instruction manual for his own sons on how to be men? He was trying to transform his sons from boys to men when he wrote the Proverbs. So you gals and guys that have little boys, somewhere around puberty, you ought to start teaching them the Proverbs. You want to transform them into little boys, into men, from God's perspective. That's why Solomon wrote these. And look at what he tells his sons in Proverbs 6:6-8. He said, go to the ant, you sluggard. You know what a sluggard is? Another word for it is a sloth. A sloth is absolutely the laziest mammal God has ever created. A sloth is this ugly, dirty, hairy-looking, parasite-laden animal that hangs upside down on a branch of a tree, and the mortality rate among sloths is high because they are too lazy to move off that branch and get food. I'm telling you the truth. About their only source of nourishment comes from the parasites that get on them, and they will eat the bugs off themselves. But if they have to move to another branch to get a fresh supply of food, they will starve to death and fall out of the tree. Many of them live their entire life hanging on the same branch that they were born on. That, my friend, is lazy. I know people like that, and you probably do too. And he says, so Solomon is telling his sons, I don't want you to be a sluggard. I don't want you to learn lessons from the sluggard. I want you to learn lessons from the ant. Because you know what's true about the ant? The ants are the most industrious of insects that God created. Ants are working all the time. Ants are gathering food all the time. They're building bigger burrows in their little ant hole to store more food all the time. You never see an ant sitting around on his backside doing nothing. There is no such thing as a couch potato ant. It's not there. They are industrious. So go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. So if you learn to be diligent like the ant, he says you are what? On your way to being wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in the summer and gathers its food in the harvest. I'm going to give you this too. Can I give you this little parenting tip? Some of you are parents. Let me give you this. Don't let your kids hang around with other kids who are lazy, because they will learn to be lazy. And you don't want that. You don't want that at all. You need to have kids that are taught to be diligent and industrious, and you don't need that influence. So if you got some teenager lives across the street and that kid's lazy, sleeping until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when school's out, and they're obviously not very diligent, they are obviously lazy, then you need to do something. You need to keep your kid away from that. I can't believe I opened up that whole discussion. Got all these teenagers in the room. Let me say this to you who are the parents of these teenagers. If you're letting them sleep till 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when school's out, you ain't doing them any favors. Get that? You know what you're letting them do? You're letting them learn to be lazy. It's a stifling effect on their diligence, and it's not wise. So I know you kids love that. I'm not going to ask for a survey about how many of these teenagers sleep till 2 in the afternoon, and someone won't ask that. But anyway, just get that. Get that. And I want to give you an example of what I've been talking about here. I witnessed the destructive power of socialism on a nation's economy in the early 1990s. When I made a short-term missionary trip to Russia, Ronald Reagan, through his presidency and his administration, had bankrupted the Soviet Union. I mean, he just kept building up our military, and then in turn, they had to build up their military. Their economy was already weak. They spent so much money building up their military, their economy went bankrupt. I mean, the whole Soviet Union fell apart, thanks to Ronald Reagan's fiscal policies. And listen, that's not a Republican or a Democratic statement. That's just the facts of history. Just study the history, and you'll see that happen. So anyway, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union falling apart, I had the opportunity to go to Russia and spend a couple of weeks there, and the nation was bankrupt. Stores were empty. Bread lines were long. We were driving along on a bus one day. We were going to a public school to actually teach the Bible in a public school in Russia immediately after the collapse of that Soviet Union. And so we were driving along there, and I had my little translator sitting next to me, and we were driving along there, and there was this huge crowd of people up in front of us on the sidewalk in front of this building. And I nudged this kid, and I said, what's this? What's going on up here? And he said, that's a supermarket. They just got a fresh supply of bread in. And people were just swarming the place because for weeks there had been no bread. And so they were it was just packed outside. And he said, all those people won't get bread. The nation was bankrupt. You know why Russia went bankrupt? Socialism. We call it communism, but it was socialism. The government owned everything. Everybody worked for the government, and there was no diligence, and so productivity went down, and ultimately the nation went bankrupt. So here's the thing. People were desperate. I saw this at the hotel we were staying in. There were women standing on the streets, sweeping the sidewalks with worn-out brooms and absolutely no initiative. I mean, their job was to sweep the streets, and that's what they were doing. Now, the nation was bankrupt. They hadn't been able to get them new brooms in months, and so their brooms were wore out, but they were out there sweeping the streets, and they had absolutely no initiative. They weren't sweeping up anything. They had dustpans. They weren't sweeping up anything into those dustpans and putting it in the containers. They were just sweeping the dust around in circles. They were just sweeping the trash around in circles, hour after hour after hour. And I asked my teenage guide, why are these women just stirring this dirt up in circles rather than actually picking it up off the streets? And he said, they don't get paid anymore by the government if they work hard or if they barely work at all, so they barely work. Do you get that? Fiscal equality doesn't work. Even a teenager could see what a socialist economic system had done to his nation. I certainly hope that the American voters in 2020 are as perceptive as that Russian teenager was. And if so, they won't vote for any liberal presidential candidate who promotes socialism. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, that's not the issue. The issue is an economic system that works and one that doesn't work. Capitalism has served this country well for over 200 years. A system that rewards diligence, a system that rewards the private ownership of property, a system that is built on the principles of the Word of God works. The other system doesn't work. History proves that. So let's look at some lessons from history. History is packed with examples of the destructive power of socialism on a nation's economic strength. I want to give you a list of nations who have learned this lesson the hard way. I've already talked about Russia, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Hong Kong, Chile, Estonia, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Albania, Angola, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Congo, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, Hungary, North Korea, Mongolia, Mozambique, Poland, Romania, Somalia, Yemen, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Bangladesh, India, Portugal, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Algeria, Burma, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Madagascar, Sudan, Syria, and most recently Greece. Do you remember just a couple of years ago, Greece just went totally bankrupt? You know why? Socialism. That's why. And then, what's the country right now? Venezuela. Venezuela. Socialism doesn't work. Listen to me. If socialism worked, the caravans that are coming from South America and trying to invade the United States and illegally cross the border between us and Mexico, they wouldn't be making the trip all the way up here. If socialism is so wonderful and if it would work, they would be going to Venezuela. There's not one caravan going to Venezuela. People are trying to leave Venezuela and come here. Why? Capitalism works because it's biblical. Socialism does not work because it is not biblical. It is the runaway imagination of the fallen minds of mankind that has devised that kind of system. In spite of a consistent history of the failure of socialist economies, the liberal politicians of the United States seem determined to turn to socialism. And by so doing, repeat its historic results. Isn't that a little ridiculous? When you've got lesson after lesson after lesson, example after example after example from history of nations who have gone bankrupt because they turned to socialism, why in the world would you want to do that? There's only one reason. And this is a little touchy, but I'm going to give it to you. It's because the public school system in America today is by and large in the hands of liberals, the people who create the curriculum. The people who train the teachers, the universities of our nation today are largely in the hands of liberal educators who have educated a generation of young people not to understand this lesson that I've given you today. They have educated them to believe that socialism is the answer to all evils. And it isn't. Do you understand that? And so guess what? The highest rate of voters when they're surveyed, the voters who are most likely to vote for a socialist candidate for political office, guess where they lie? Millennials. because they've been educated to believe that. That doesn't mean the millennials are bad kids. It just means that's what they've been educated to believe, and the church has sat by and let that happen. Because we haven't talked about stuff like this. That's why God convicted me back in the last part of last year to talk about things that need to be said. And so, failure to learn lessons from history is foolish, isn't it? If you don't learn lessons from history, that's foolish. King Solomon wrote this: as the dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. I mean, you see something that doesn't work and you do it, and it doesn't work. And if you recover, then you turn around and do it again, and it doesn't work again. And when you recover, you turn around and do it again. What's the Bible definition of that? Fool. Fool. So if we got all these lessons in history about how strong economic countries turned to socialism and went bankrupt, and we say, oh, we need to be socialist. That is foolish. That's absolutely foolish. But that's what we're seeing play out right before us in the political arena of America today. Here's the conclusion. Silver-tongued liberal presidential candidates may make their sales pitch for socialism sound very attractive during one of their campaign speeches. Fiscal equality, vilifying the wealthy. You know, in order to get people to buy into socialism, you got to make it kind of evil to be wealthy. You got to vilify the wealthy. Don't we see that today? I mean, I see Jenny and I occasionally we'll have some time and we may watch a John Wayne movie or something like that on a cable TV channel, and these commercials come on, encouraging people, if they've got this disease or that disease or another disease, to sue a corporation. We can't let these wealthy corporations get by with this. What is that doing? Vilifying corporate America, because that's where most of the wealth is. Do you get that? That's wrong. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy if you're diligent and you earn it in a way that is appropriate. And so, but you have to vilify the wealthy in order to get people to buy into socialism. You say, well, I want to be wealthy. Go to work. I tell young people this. I know, so wonder they don't like me. They say, man, I'd like to have what you have. I say, get a job. Do you understand that? Get a job and be diligent at your job. Go to work. Don't expect the government to hand it to you, because the government can only give you what it takes away from somebody else, and that's theft. That's stealing. Oh, I can't believe you got me started on all that. But look at these things that they're campaigning. Fiscal equality, vilifying the wealthy, eradicating poverty, free college tuition for everyone. Who's going to pay for that? Free college tuition for everyone. Free medical care for everyone. Do you know what happens in countries that go to socialized medicine? Socialized health care? Do you know what happens? People die waiting for treatment because there's no diligence on the part of the medical community. If we see 5 patients today, fine. If we see 3 patients today, fine. There's no drive for doctors to have cutting edge skills. Why? I'm going to get paid the same by the government anyway. Do you get that? Do you really want socialized medicine? Do you really want Medicare for all? Let me ask you this. Now, this may be really ugly. How many of you have had any dealings with the VA healthcare system? You had some dealings with that? Is it because that's what you wanted? Or is it because that's what was available? I've been to some VA hospitals and seen people there that didn't get the best health care. I mean, there are lawsuits going on all over the country today because people didn't get the best health care in a government-run, socialized health care system. So much so that the government is arguing in Congress now about what to do about the quality of care in the VA system. Now, I love veterans, and I think we ought to do all kinds of stuff for veterans. In fact, we have our freedoms because of the veterans. I understand that. But listen, socialized medicine is not the answer. Never has been. Never has been. And then they want A $15 minimum wage. Get us all the same, $15 for everybody. Well, in the South, that might look good if you're making 8.25. But what if you're making $20 an hour? Because you know what's going to happen? The minimum wage in socialism becomes the wage. You get that? Because in order for us to pay everybody below $15 up to $15, we're going to have to take that money from somewhere. We're going to take it from that fellow that's making $20 an hour and bring him down where everybody else is. Remember, fiscal equality. Now, these politicians aren't going to tell you that, but just do the math. Just do the math. I want to tell you one more story, and then we're going to close. I was talking to a girl yesterday on the phone. I'm not going to tell you who she is, but she rents a house from me, and they're real good kids that pay their rent and all that. They're millennials. And they rent this house from me, and she called and she began to explain what had happened. And instead of having all of their rent, they were going to have about 2/3 of their rent yesterday when it was due. But could they pay the rest of it the next week? And I said, sure, you can. That's no problem. And she said, I'm working at this particular company. She called the name of it, and she said, because of all the flooding and all the stuff, they haven't been able to get the steel to the company that I work for, and therefore we don't have the material to work with, and so they've laid off about 3/4 of the workforce. And I was out of work for about 2 weeks and won't go to work maybe till the next week, and that's really hurt me. And she said, I think the government ought to pay people when there's a natural disaster. Pay you for not working, as if it's the government's fault that there was a natural disaster. And she thinks that company ought to go ahead and pay them while they're not working. And I didn't say anything to her about it, but when I hung up, I told Jenny, I said, this girl ain't got it. I said, where is the company going to get the money to pay these people if they don't have the material to make the product, to be able to sell it, to get the money to pay them? Do you get that? She don't get it. And I feel for her, and I'm going to work with her and try to help her along and all that stuff. But the whole point is, she is a millennial, and she has bought into this socialist idea that somehow the government ought to pay me a certain amount of money, whether I work or not. That's socialism. That's not biblical. It's just not there. One more paragraph, and then we're done. All I know to say is this. Please remember the words of King Solomon. This is what he wrote in Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that appears to be right. Just on the surface, if you don't know anything about the Bible, the idea that we all make the same amount of money, that sounds good, doesn't it? Especially if the amount of money that they said is above what you're making right now. Oh, we said, wow, we want that. That appears to be right. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. Socialism may look so good to the uninformed individual, but pursuing it to the point that you have an economy in a nation that embraces socialism will lead to the death of that economy. It'll lead to the death of that economy. That nation will go bankrupt. So in this case, socialism, as right as it may seem on the surface, will certainly lead to the death of the U.S. economy if we elect politicians that will implement it. Just like it has in virtually every country where it has ever been implemented. Study the history. Study the history. That's all you have to do. Now, I said all that, and I think it needed to be said. I gave you scripture for it. It's not political. Don't get mad and go out and say, he's Republican. I tell you what, I got over being a Republican or a Democrat a long time ago. Can I confess to you that in 1976 was the first presidential year that I could vote? And you know what I did? I voted for Jimmy Carter because he was a born-again Christian. You know the history? He was a Democrat. Okay? And then I've voted for Republicans. But you know what the deal is? I got over considering myself a Democrat or a Republican a long time ago. I consider myself a patriotic American Christian. And I vote for whatever I think is the best for the country. And I think that's what everybody ought to do. When we get closer to the election, I'll talk more about that. But I think that's what everybody ought to do.